They gave us tickets for a Wednesday. They told us it was going to be a fun evening, a nice show, go home, sleep well. Nobody told us what was actually going to happen on that stage. Nobody warned us. Nobody could have known. I was 26 years old. I have been thinking about those 11 minutes for 57 years. My name is Frank Donnelly. I am 83 years old. I was in the audience the night Hulk Hogan told Bruce Lee he would regret this forever on live television. And what happened 5 seconds later is still, to this day, the most extraordinary thing I have ever seen a human being do.
It started 3 weeks before the taping, in Johnny Carson's office on the second floor of NBC Burbank. Carson was meeting with Fred de Cordova, who had been producing the show for a year, and who understood better than almost anyone in television what made an audience remember an evening rather than simply enjoy it. They had been reviewing the November sweeps numbers, and the numbers were good, but good was not what Carson wanted. Good was Tuesday. Friday needed to be something else. "I want Bruce Lee," Carson said. He was leaning back in his chair, doing the thing he did with pencils when he was thinking, tossing one end to the other in a slow rotation. He was on last year, and the mail was extraordinary. People called this show and wrote letters about that segment for 3 months. Fred agreed that Bruce would be available. He was between projects in late 1972, waiting on the Warner Brothers deal that would eventually produce Enter the Dragon, and American television exposure was something his team understood was valuable. "But I want something with tension," Carson said. "I don't want to just have him talk about philosophy again. I want something where the audience is physically uncomfortable and can't look away." Fred waited. "There's a wrestler I've been watching," Carson said. "Young kid, not even 20 yet, name's Terry Bollea, but they're calling him Hulk Hogan on the circuit because of the size. He's out of Tampa. Vincent McMahon's been using him as a special attraction on his tours because the kid is genuinely remarkable to look at. 6'4", 280 pounds, and not a pound of it that looks like it belongs to anything less than an absolute force of nature. He's young, he's got a mouth on him, he's ambitious, and from what I hear, he doesn't like being told that someone else in the room is more impressive than he is." Fred looked at his producer's notes. "Johnny, if something goes wrong between a 280-pound wrestler and a 140-pound martial artist on live television, that's exactly why people will watch, Fred." That conversation set everything in motion. Bruce Lee accepted the booking within a day. The format was standard Tonight Show, first guest position, 8 to 10 minutes of conversation about his philosophy and his career. He asked his usual condition. No advance announcement of his appearance, no promotion beforehand, surprise or nothing. The production agreed. Hulk Hogan's booking was more complicated. He was still young enough that his schedule was managed by the promoters rather than by his own team, and getting him to Burbank on a Wednesday required a rearrangement of a Florida date. But when his contact heard Tonight Show and 28 million viewers, the Florida date was rescheduled. What nobody told Hogan, what Fred de Cordova deliberately chose not to mention in the booking conversation, was something a producer had said casually in a call 2 days earlier. The producer had said, offhand, almost as a throwaway observation, that Bruce Lee was the most impressive physical specimen Carson had ever had on the show. Fred knew what those words would do to a 19-year-old who had spent the last 2 years building an entire identity around being the most physically impressive person in every room. He left them out of the conversation. Some things, Fred understood, are better discovered on the night. Hogan arrived at NBC Burbank at 3:15 in the afternoon, almost an hour early, which was itself a signal about his state of mind. He had driven himself from his hotel in a rental car, which was notable because his contact had offered to send a car, and he had declined. He came alone. He walked through the production entrance carrying a single bag, and the first thing he did after being shown to his dressing room was ask who the other guest was. The production assistant who showed him to the room told him, "Bruce Lee." Hogan set his bag down on the table. He sat on the couch. He said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "The Kung Fu guy?" The production assistant said yes. Hogan said, "And they want to put us on the same show." The production assistant said yes. Second segment, after Bruce's solo conversation with Johnny. Hogan leaned back. He was 19 years old, and he was already 6'4" and 280 pounds, and the couch under him was making the sounds that furniture makes when it was built for a different category of person. He looked at the ceiling for a moment. Then he said, "I heard Carson called him the most impressive physical specimen he'd ever had on the show." The production assistant, who had not known this, said he wasn't sure about that. Hogan said, "I heard it. People talk." He was quiet again for a moment. Then he said, not to the production assistant, more to the ceiling, or to himself, or to the specific future that he had always been building toward with the focused intensity of a person who has decided very young that they are going to become something specific. We'll see about that. Bruce Lee arrived at 5. He came through the side entrance with no one accompanying him, carrying a small leather bag, wearing a dark jacket and dark trousers, moving through the corridor with the quality that anyone who was ever near him in person tried afterward to describe and generally failed to fully capture. The production assistant who walked him to his dressing room told me about it years later. She said he walked on a concrete floor, and she heard nothing. No footsteps. As if the floor had agreed to accommodate him in some way that floors didn't normally agree to accommodate people. He was shown to his dressing room and he put his bag down and he began to stretch, methodically, every joint. The ritual of someone who prepares for everything and performs nothing. At 6:30, Fred came to brief him on the format. Bruce listened. When Fred got to the part about the second guest, he said, "Tell me about him." Fred told him, 19 years old, wrestler, Tampa, 280 pounds, 6'4", undefeated on the regional circuit, young, ambitious, physically extraordinary for his age. Bruce said, "Does he know what to expect?" Fred said, "He knows you'll be on the show. He doesn't know the specific format of the segment." Bruce said, "What does he think of the booking?" Fred said, carefully, "He's aware that you've been described in flattering terms by this show. He may have some feelings about that." Bruce said, "A young man with a lot of physical confidence who's been told someone else is more impressive. That's a specific kind of situation." Fred said yes. Bruce said, "And you want to put us on the same stage?" Fred said, "It makes for interesting television." Bruce looked at him, the specific way he looked at things that required his complete attention. He said, "Fred, I need you to hear me on something." Fred said, "Of course." He said, "I don't perform for tension. I'm not going to play a role in a television segment designed to create the appearance of conflict. If something real happens between two people, that's real. I won't manufacture it. If this young man wants to have a real conversation, I'll have a real conversation. If he wants to do something else, that's his choice, and it will produce its own result." Fred said, "I understand." Bruce said, "I'm not sure you do, but we'll find out." Fred left the dressing room and went back to the production area with the specific feeling of a person who has set something in motion and is no longer certain they understand the shape of what they've set in motion. At 8:45, 45 minutes before showtime, the thing happened that changed the evening from what it was planned to be. Hogan left his dressing room to walk through his entrance route, the way performers do before a taping, to feel the path from the corridor to the curtain, to understand the geography of the stage. It's a professional habit, the preparation of someone who doesn't want physical uncertainty during the actual performance. His route took him past Bruce's dressing room. The door was open. Hogan stopped. Bruce was shadowboxing in the center of the small room. And what Hogan saw, what stopped him in a corridor he was walking through, with the confidence of someone who had stopped being physically surprised by anything at age 16, was something that his brain spent several seconds trying to categorize. Speed was the category his brain kept trying, but speed wasn't right, not exactly. What Hogan was seeing wasn't just fast movement. It was movement that seemed to occupy a different relationship with time from the movement of other people, as if Bruce's body was running a different calculation from the one human bodies were supposed to run. Hogan stood in the doorway and watched for about 5 seconds. Then he laughed. He didn't decide to laugh. It came out of him the way things come out of a 19-year-old who has been told their whole life that their physical gifts are supreme and who has just encountered something that threatens that narrative and hasn't yet found the right response to that threat. The laugh was the sound of someone reaching for a way to organize what they'd seen into a category that didn't require them to revise anything important about themselves. Bruce stopped mid-sequence. He turned. He looked at the doorway. The two of them looked at each other for the first time. Hogan leaned against the doorframe. He was almost too wide for it. He looked down at Bruce with the casual physical ease of someone who had been taller than most people for so long that looking down was just how he looked at the world. He said, "So you're the one they've been making all the fuss about." His voice was younger than his size suggested. 19 years old has a specific quality in the voice that the body doesn't match when the body is already 6'4" and 280. Bruce said nothing. He was looking at Hogan the way he looked at things that required the complete version of his attention. Hogan said, "I've seen your movies. Or parts of them. You're quick for a little guy, I'll give you that. Good for the camera." He said good for the camera, with the specific tone of someone inserting a distinction that is also a dismissal. Bruce said, "You're very large for 19. Hogan's eyebrows went up slightly. He hadn't expected that. He said, 20 in March. Bruce said, "The size will keep coming for a few more years." Hogan said, "Yeah. And then there's going to be a lot of people who need to figure out how to deal with what I become." Bruce said, "That's probably true." Hogan looked at him. The agreement wasn't what he expected either. He said, "You're not what I thought you'd be." Bruce said, "What did you think I'd be?" Hogan said, "Smaller and more scared of me." Bruce said, "The scared part is still on the table. We'll find out tonight." He said it the way he said everything, even, clear, without any of the performance of confidence that most people attach to the words confidence produces. He said it the way someone states a fact. Hogan looked at him for a moment. Then he said the thing that Gerald Myers, the production assistant who arrived at the end of the corridor at exactly the wrong moment, would write in his diary that night and keep private for 30 years. He said, "Here's what's going to happen. They're going to put us on that stage together, and every single person watching is going to be looking at me, because they always look at me, and I'm going to pick you up, lift you off the ground in front of 28 million people, just to show them what real looks like next to what you are, and you'll regret this forever, because you'll spend the rest of your career having people remember the night Hulk Hogan held you in the air like a prop on national television." He said it without malice. He said it the way a very young and very physically gifted person says the true thing they believe about themselves and the world, which is the most dangerous kind of honesty, the kind that comes from certainty rather than cruelty. Bruce looked at him. He said, "I'll be ready." 3 words. No performance. No threat. No warning. Gerald Myers, pressing himself against the corridor wall behind Hogan, wrote in his diary, "I don't know what those 3 words meant, but they made me feel like I was watching something about to break. 11:16 p.m., live, 28 million people watching. Carson had already done the monologue and settled in. The first guest conversation with Bruce had run 9 minutes, and it had been exactly what it always was with Bruce, the specific combination of philosophical depth and genuine warmth that made audiences feel like they were receiving something rather than watching something. Carson asked about water, about being formless, about what it meant to train every day for 15 years. Bruce's answers were the answers of someone who had built something real and could describe it simply. The audience was warm and engaged and fully present. Then Carson's expression shifted, the shift that meant something specific was coming. He said, "My next guest tonight is someone I've been hearing about for a couple of years now, coming up through the wrestling circuit. He is, and I want to be specific about this, the most physically imposing young person I have ever seen footage of, and I've seen footage of a lot of people. He is 19 years old, and he is already 6'4" and 280 pounds. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Hulk Hogan." The curtain opened, and the audience gasped. Not a polite intake. An actual, involuntary, collective intake of breath from 450 people simultaneously encountering something that their sense of scale was not prepared for. Hogan walked through the curtain, and the stage did the thing stages do when someone of his physical presence walks onto them, which is contract. Everything looked slightly smaller. The desk, the chairs, the painted backdrop. The dimensions of the room were the same, but the perception of them shifted. He walked to the desk with the walk, the rolling, certain walk of a young person for whom physical confidence was so deep it had become indistinguishable from their baseline personality. He shook Carson's hand. Carson visibly adjusted the strength of his grip. Then Hogan turned to the couch where Bruce was sitting. He looked at Bruce for a moment, the way he had looked at him in the corridor. Then he sat down in the guest chair. Carson began the 3-way conversation with the warmth and precision of the best television host who ever lived, finding the first question that would open something useful without igniting something unmanageable. He asked Hogan about his background, about wrestling, about what the circuit was like when you were 19, and already this size. Hogan was good. He had the instincts of someone who was going to be a performer, who understood cameras and understood audiences even without the years of experience that usually produce that understanding. He was funny, he was specific, he was charming in the way of a person who has been performing confidence for so long that the performance has become the character. Carson bridged to the obvious. He said, "Now, I want to talk about what I think everyone in this room is thinking about, which is that I have 2 people on my stage tonight who represent 2 completely different ideas about what physical capability means. Strength, size, mass, on one side. Speed, technique, precision, on the other. I want to know what each of you thinks about what the other has." Hogan went first. He said he had genuine respect for what Bruce did. He said the speed was impressive. He said technique was a real thing, and he didn't dismiss it. Then he said, "But I've been in situations my whole life where people have technique, and I just pick them up, and the technique stops working when they're in the air." The audience laughed, the laugh of people receiving a joke that is also not a joke. Carson said, "Bruce, What do you say to that? Bruce said, he's describing a real thing. If someone can get you off the ground, your options change completely. The question is whether the someone can get you off the ground. Hogan said, I can get anyone off the ground. He said it the way a 19-year-old says the true thing they believe about themselves. Carson said, that's a bold claim. Hogan said, it's not a claim. It's a fact. I've been picking people up since I was 16. I've never met anyone I couldn't get off the ground. Bruce said, then you've been meeting the wrong people. The room went to the quiet that rooms go to when something has been said that is both a joke and not a joke, and nobody is certain yet which one is operating. If you think that exchange was where the evening peaked, what happened 4 minutes later will show you the peak was nowhere close. Carson tried to steer into philosophical territory, the move he made when he sensed that two people on his couch were heading somewhere the format couldn't contain, and he needed to buy time. He asked Bruce about the concept of using an opponent's force against them. Hogan listened. His expression was the expression of someone listening to something they find interesting and also find irrelevant to their specific situation. He said, that works. With someone who's trying to strike you. I'm not going to strike you. I'm going to grab you, and once I have you, that philosophy doesn't apply. Bruce said, show me. The room made the sound it made. Carson said, I'd like to keep this as a conversation. Hogan said, you said show me. Bruce said, you've been describing picking people up for the last 4 minutes. Show me. Hogan looked at him. He looked at him the way a person looks at something they have completely categorized and are slightly surprised to be challenged by. Then he stood up. When Hulk Hogan stood up at 19 years old in the Tonight Show studio in 1972, the physical reality of it was something that the television cameras only partially captured. In person, in that room, the standing up of someone 6'4" and 280 who had spent his entire life occupying more physical space than the space around him was built for, was its own kind of event. Bruce did not stand up. He remained seated, looking up at Hogan with the complete attention he gave to things that required complete attention. Hogan said, you want me to try? Bruce said, I want to see what happens. Carson said, with the specific urgency of a host who has arrived at the edge of his format's capacity, we're going to take a very quick break. But Hogan was already reaching. He bent toward Bruce with both hands out, the grab of someone who has done this thousands of times in training and competition, whose body knows exactly how to acquire a person and get them into the air. The grab was real and fast and committed, the reach of someone for whom picking up other people was the oldest and most reliable thing their body knew how to do. Bruce was not where the reach went. The movement he made was the movement that I have been trying to describe for 57 years and that I still cannot fully describe, because the problem with describing it is that there is no useful frame of reference for it. Most people move, and you can track the movement, you can follow it from point A to point B. What Bruce Lee did was move, and the tracking was not available. He was in one place. Then he was in a different place. The transition between those two places was not something the eye could account for. Hogan's reach found nothing, and his committed weight carried him forward into the space where Bruce had been. Bruce stood up. He was standing when Hogan straightened up from the missed grab, and they were now side by side rather than above and below, and what Bruce did then was the thing that I have not told anyone except my wife for 57 years, because I was not certain anyone would believe me. He put his hand on Hogan's shoulder, not to grab, not to strike, not to anything that looks like the beginning of anything, his hand on Hogan's shoulder, the way you put your hand on someone's shoulder when you are standing next to them and are about to say something. Hogan felt the hand. He turned to look at it. Then he looked at Bruce. Then he tried to move his right shoulder. He couldn't move his right shoulder. He tried again. His shoulder was not available to him. Whatever Bruce's hand was doing at that specific point on that specific part of his body, the result was that 280 pounds of Hulk Hogan's right side had been temporarily placed outside his control. His face went through something that I watched from my seat in the audience and that I have never forgotten. Surprise first, then confusion, then something more specific, the expression of someone whose fundamental understanding of how their own body works has just been contradicted, and who is standing in the middle of a live television show with no available category for what is happening to them. Bruce said something to him quietly. Too quiet for the boom mic to catch, too quiet for the audience to hear. Hogan was looking at Bruce. Bruce said the quiet thing again, and Hogan sat down. Not because he was forced, not because anything physical compelled him. He sat down the way a person sits down when they have received a piece of information that has changed the terms of the situation they're in, and sitting down is the honest physical response to changed terms. The studio was so quiet that I could hear the camera equipment running. Carson, who had been against the back wall of the set, with both hands pressed against the painted backdrop, walked back to his desk. He sat down. He straightened his jacket. He looked at both of them. He looked at the camera. He looked back at both of them. He said, "Well, that was it." He said, "Well," and then he waited, because that was the thing about Carson. He understood when the situation required him to speak less rather than more, and he had the discipline to do the less. Hogan said, to Bruce, rather than to the camera, rather than to the audience, rather than to 28 million people. What was that? Bruce said, "Your size requires your body to maintain specific balance points at all times. You've never had to think about this because nothing you've encountered has ever challenged those balance points." "I found one." Hogan said, "You made my shoulder stop working." Bruce said, "I interrupted a signal. Briefly. It's already back." Hogan moved his shoulder. It moved. He moved it again. He looked at it. He said, "You could have done more." Bruce said, "Yes." Hogan said, "You chose not to." Bruce said, "We're on television." Hogan was quiet. Then he said something that the audience heard and that went out on the East Coast broadcast, and that was the specific sentence that made the switchboard at NBC receive more calls in a single evening than any episode of The Tonight Show had received in the previous 4 years. He said, "What would you have done if we weren't?" Bruce looked at him. He said, "The same thing, probably. I wasn't trying to hurt you. I was showing you something." Hogan said, "What were you showing me?" Bruce said, "That the world is larger than what you've encountered so far. You're 19 years old and you are genuinely extraordinary for your age. What you can do is real. What I showed you doesn't take any of that away. It adds something." Hogan said, "What does it add?" Bruce said, "The understanding that there are things you haven't encountered yet. That's useful information." Carson said, from behind his desk, in the specific quiet voice of someone who has just watched something happen that he is still processing while simultaneously being responsible for a live television show, "I want to say something." Everyone looked at him. He said, "I have been sitting at this desk for 9 years. I have had presidents and astronauts and the most remarkable people I know how to find, and I want to be honest with you tonight, which I try to be every night, but tonight requires a specific kind of honesty. I had no idea what was going to happen when I put these two people on the same stage. What I hoped for was interesting television. What I got was something that I don't have a name for yet." He looked at Bruce. He said, "You told my producer you were calculating the whole time." Bruce said, "Yes." He said, "Were you calculating that?" Bruce said, "I was calculating what would be useful, what he needed to encounter, what the situation required." Hogan was listening to this exchange. His face had the quality of someone who is taking something in rather than responding to it, the specific face of a very young person who has just had their model of something updated and is in the process of incorporating the update. He said to Bruce, "You could have just said no when I said I was going to pick you up. You could have said no." Bruce said, "I could have." Hogan said, "But you said show me." Bruce said, "Yes." Hogan said, "Why?" Bruce said, "Because telling someone something is one kind of information, showing them is different. You would have believed a no for about 2 minutes and then gone back to what you believed before. What happened instead, you'll still be thinking about when you're 40. Hogan looked at him. He said, "You'll regret this forever." "That's what I said to you in the hallway." Bruce said, "I heard you." Hogan said, "I said that because I thought I was going to pick you up on national television, and that would be the story everyone told about tonight." Bruce said, "And instead." Hogan said, "And instead, you're probably going to be telling this story about me." Bruce said quietly, "No, this is your story too." "What you did tonight is not a small thing," Hogan said. "I got embarrassed on live television." Bruce said, "You encountered something you'd never encountered. You didn't run from it. You sat back down and you stayed in the conversation and you asked real questions. That's not embarrassment. That's something else." The studio was still very quiet. Carson said, "Bruce, what is that? When someone does what he just did?" Bruce said, "It's the beginning of something. When you're 19 and you've been the biggest and strongest person in every room for 5 years, the beginning of something is a gift. And most people don't get it this early. Most people get it at 40, and they spend 10 years being bitter about it before they figure out what to do with it." He looked at Hogan. He said, "You have time to do something with it." Hogan was looking at his hands, the hands that had reached for Bruce, and found nothing. He looked at them for a moment, and then he looked at Bruce. He said, "Would you show me what you did, how you did it?" Bruce said, That takes more than a television segment. Hogan said, I know. I mean later. Sometime. Would you show me? Bruce looked at him. He said, yes. Carson said, ladies and gentlemen, I have to go to commercial. But I want you to know that what you just watched was not produced, was not scripted, was not arranged by anyone on this show. Two people sat on this couch and told each other the truth, in their own way, and something happened. That's all I know how to call it. Something happened. He went to commercial. In the corridor behind the studio, afterward, Gerald Myers was there when they came off the stage. He wrote in his diary, which I read decades later when he shared it with me before he passed. Hogan came off stage first, and he walked to his dressing room, and he sat on the couch, and he sat there for a while, and he didn't say anything. And then Bruce came past and he stopped at the open door, and he said something I couldn't hear, and Hogan nodded, and Bruce went to his own dressing room. And that was the end of it. Except it wasn't the end of it. It was clearly the beginning of something. I just didn't know the beginning of what. I drove home that night in silence. My wife asked me how the show was, and I said I don't know how to answer that yet. She thought I was being strange. I wasn't being strange. I was trying to find the words for something that didn't have words. What I kept coming back to, driving home, what I have kept coming back to for 57 years, is the moment after the grab that found nothing, when Bruce stood up and put his hand on Hogan's shoulder, and Hogan couldn't move his shoulder, and the room was completely silent. Not the technique, not the physical thing. What came after? Hogan sitting back down, not being made to sit down. Sitting down, a 19-year-old who had spent 5 years being the biggest and strongest thing in every room he entered, sitting down because something had happened that updated his understanding of the room, and instead of refusing the update or performing a version of himself that didn't need it, he sat down and stayed in the conversation and asked real questions. That was the extraordinary thing. Not what Bruce did with his hand, what Hogan did with what Bruce's hand showed him. Bruce Lee died 7 months after that Wednesday. He was 32 years old. I heard the news on the radio, and I pulled into a parking lot and sat there for a while. I thought about the corridor, about "you'll regret this forever," said, with the specific certainty of a 19-year-old who has never encountered a reason to doubt themselves, and about what happened instead of forever regret. About Bruce saying, "This is your story too." About, "Would you show me sometime?" And the answer, yes, and what it meant that a question like that got a yes. I am 83 years old. That was the best Wednesday of my life. That's the whole story.